In a quiet little town surrounded by lush green hills and thick forests, life usually moved at a slow, predictable pace. People knew each other's names, shared meals during festivals, and waved hello as they passed on the streets. But one day, something happened that shook the entire community to its core. 5 completely unrelated people died on the exact same day. It started early in the morning when Emma, a kind-hearted schoolteacher, didn't show up for her class. Her students waited patiently, thinking she might be running late, but hours passed without a word from her. Finally, someone went to check on her and found her lying motionless in her living room. She was gone, though no one could explain why. Just an hour later, news spread about James, a retired mechanic who had spent most of his days fixing cars and telling stories to anyone who would listen. He had been found slumped over his workbench, tools still in hand, as if he'd simply fallen asleep mid-task. By noon, panic began to ripple through the town. Priya, a bright college student known for her laughter and dreams of becoming a doctor, collapsed while walking home from the library. Paramedics rushed to the scene, but it was too late. Then came Mark, a delivery driver who always greeted customers with a smile. His van was discovered abandoned on the side of the road, engine still running, with him sitting lifeless behind the wheel. And finally, there was Sarah, a nurse who had dedicated her life to helping others. She was last seen tending to patients at the local clinic before collapsing in the hallway, leaving everyone stunned. What made this string of deaths so baffling was that none of these 5 individuals seemed connected in any way. They were different ages, lived in separate parts of town, and hadn't interacted with one another. At least not recently. There were no signs of illness, accidents, or foul play. It was as if some invisible force had swept through the town, claiming them all without warning. The townsfolk struggled to make sense of it. Some whispered about curses, pointing to old legends of restless spirits haunting the nearby woods. Others blamed bad luck or strange weather patterns, even though the skies had been clear and calm. A few skeptics suggested it might just be a bizarre coincidence, though deep down, even they couldn't fully believe that explanation. As the sun set that evening, the streets grew eerily silent. Neighbors peeked out of their windows, exchanging worried glances. Shops closed earlier than usual, and children were called inside long before bedtime. The air felt heavier somehow, as if the town itself was holding its breath, waiting for answers that never came. In the days that followed, preparations began for a joint funeral, a decision made by the families, hoping it would bring some comfort to the grieving community. Yet even as plans unfolded, a sense of unease lingered. Flowers placed near photographs of the deceased wilted overnight. Candles meant to honor their memories flickered wildly, despite there being no breeze. Whispers echoed faintly in empty rooms where the caskets were kept. No one could explain it, but everyone felt it, the feeling that something wasn't quite right. And so, as the town prepared to say goodbye, questions remained unanswered. Why had these 5 ordinary people died on the same day? Was it truly a coincidence, or was there something darker at play? Little did anyone know, the real mystery was only just beginning. The decision to hold a joint funeral was made quickly, though not without hesitation. The families of the 5 deceased, Emma, James, Priya, Mark, and Sarah, felt overwhelmed by grief, but also drawn together by the strange circumstances surrounding their loved ones' deaths. They hoped that combining the services would bring some solace to the community and help them find closure. After all, how could they mourn alone when so many shared the same pain? The local church became the chosen venue, its tall stained glass windows casting colorful patterns on the wooden floors. Father Thomas, an elderly priest who had served the town for decades, agreed to lead the ceremony. He tried to reassure the families, telling them that even in times of confusion and sorrow, faith could guide them through. But privately, he couldn't shake off his own unease. Something about this situation felt wrong. As preparations began, odd things started happening almost immediately. Volunteers arrived early to decorate the church with flowers and candles, creating a peaceful atmosphere for the mourners. Yet every time someone placed fresh blooms near the caskets, the petals wilted within minutes, turning brown and crumbling to dust. It happened so consistently that people began avoiding those areas altogether, whispering nervously among themselves. Then there were the candles. Dozens of them were lit around the altar to symbolize hope and remembrance. But instead of burning steadily, their flames danced erratically, flickering wildly as if caught in a storm, even though the air inside the church was perfectly still. One volunteer, Mary, swore she heard a faint sigh every time she approached the candles to relight them. "It's just your imagination," her friend whispered, though neither of them sounded convinced. Father Thomas noticed these strange occurrences too. When he opened the heavy wooden doors of the church to let in some fresh air, they slammed shut on their own, startling him. At first, he blamed it on the wind, but when he stepped outside, the weather was calm, with barely a breeze stirring the leaves on the trees. Back inside, he picked up his Bible to prepare for the service, only to find the pages stuck together. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't pry them apart. Frustrated, he set the book down and muttered a quick prayer under his breath. Word of these eerie events spread quickly through the town. Some dismissed them as tricks of the mind, wrought on by exhaustion and grief. Others believed it was something more sinister, a sign that the dead weren't ready to rest. Despite the growing unease, no one dared cancel the funeral. The townsfolk clung to the idea that saying goodbye properly might ease whatever lingering tension hung over them. On the morning of the funeral, the church looked both beautiful and haunting. White lilies lined the aisles, though most had already begun to droop. Candles cast long shadows across the walls, their flames refusing to stay steady. The 5 polished caskets sat side by side at the front of the room, each adorned with a single rose. Everything seemed ready, but nothing felt right. As people filed into the pews, hushed conversations filled the space. Many glanced nervously toward the caskets, half expecting something to happen. Father Thomas stood at the pulpit, gripping its edges tightly. His hands trembled slightly, though he tried to hide it. He cleared his throat and forced a smile, welcoming everyone to the service. But deep down, he couldn't ignore the knot twisting in his stomach. Something was coming. Whether it was answers or chaos, no one knew. All they could do was wait, and pray that the truth wouldn't be more than they could bear. The day of the funeral dawned gray and overcast, as if the sky itself was mourning alongside the townsfolk. By mid-morning, the small church was packed to capacity. Friends, family members, and curious neighbors filled every pew, while others stood along the walls or spilled out onto the steps outside. The air inside felt unusually heavy, almost suffocating, pressing down on everyone like an invisible weight. No one spoke above a whisper, and even the children, who were usually restless during formal gatherings, sat quietly, sensing the tension in the room. Father Thomas stood nervously at the pulpit, clutching his Bible tightly. His hands trembled slightly, though he tried to steady them by gripping the edges of the wooden stand. He glanced around the crowded church, searching for reassurance in familiar faces. Instead, all he saw were worried expressions, furrowed brows, and eyes darting toward the 5 caskets lined up at the front of the room. The caskets themselves seemed to dominate the space, their polished surfaces gleaming under the dim light filtering through the stained glass windows. Each one bore a single rose, a final token of love from those left behind. But there was something unsettling about how still they looked, as if they were waiting for something, or someone, to disturb their quiet rest. As Father Thomas began speaking, his voice wavered. "We gather here today," he started, pausing to clear his throat, "to honor the lives of 5 individuals who touched our hearts in unique ways." He went on to share brief stories about each person: Emma's kindness as a teacher, James' wisdom as a mechanic, Prida's dreams of becoming a doctor, Mark's cheerful nature as a delivery driver, and Sarah's dedication as a nurse. But before he could finish, a low rumble echoed through the church. At first, people thought it was thunder outside, but when they glanced toward the windows, they saw no storm clouds in sight. The sound grew louder, vibrating through the floorboards and making the pews shake slightly. Gasps rippled through the crowd as panic began to rise. Then came the creaking, the unmistakable groan of wood shifting under pressure. Everyone turned to look at the caskets just in time to see their lids move ever so slightly. They didn't open fully, but the movement was enough to send shockwaves of terror through the room. Several mourners screamed, jumping to their feet. Others froze in place, too frightened to move. "It's settling," someone shouted, trying to calm the growing hysteria. Old buildings do that sometimes. But deep down, no one believed it. This wasn't natural. Father Thomas, trembling but determined, raised his hands in a gesture meant to soothe the crowd. "Please," he said, his voice cracking. "Stay calm. Let us pray." For a moment, the murmurs died down, and the shaking stopped. People hesitantly returned to their seats, though their eyes remained fixed on the caskets. Father Thomas took a deep breath and continued with the service, his words now rushed as if he wanted to get through them as quickly as possible. Outside, the wind picked up unexpectedly, rattling the church doors and sending leaves swirling across the ground. Inside, the candles flickered wildly again, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Someone whispered, "Do you feel that?" Indeed, the temperature had dropped significantly. Goosebumps prickled on exposed skin, and breaths turned into visible clouds of vapor. It was as if the very air had changed, charged with an energy that made everyone uneasy. And then, just as Father Thomas reached the end of his speech, another noise cut through the silence, a faint, high-pitched hum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It wasn't loud, but it was impossible to ignore. People exchanged terrified glances, unsure of what would happen next. Whatever was unfolding, one thing was certain: this was no ordinary funeral. Something, or someone, was trying to communicate, and as the hum grew louder, the entire congregation held its collective breath, bracing for whatever came next. The hum grew louder, filling the church with an otherworldly vibration that seemed to seep into everyone's bones. It wasn't just a sound. It was a presence, something alive and aware, pressing against the edges of reality. People clutched their arms tightly, trying to steady themselves as the cold intensified. Breath turned into white mist, and the flickering candles cast long, dancing shadows on the walls. The atmosphere was electric, charged with fear and anticipation. Father Thomas stood frozen at the pulpit, his Bible trembling in his hands. He tried to speak, to offer words of comfort or prayer, but his voice caught in his throat. His eyes darted toward the caskets, where the faint groaning of wood had resumed. This time, however, it wasn't subtle. The lids shifted again, louder now, as if pushed from within. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd, followed by panicked whispers. "It's moving," someone shouted, pointing toward the center casket. And then, without warning, the lid slid off completely, crashing to the floor with a deafening thud. Everyone screamed, scrambling backward in terror, but nothing emerged from inside. The casket remained empty, completely devoid of any body. Confusion spread like wildfire as people turned to look at the other 4 caskets. One by one, their lids began to shift too, sliding open with unnatural ease until all 5 were wide open, revealing nothing but empty space. "What's happening?" a woman cried, clutching her child close to her chest. Before anyone could answer, the humming stopped abruptly, replaced by silence so profound it felt suffocating. For a moment, no one dared to breathe. Then, a voice echoed through the church, not from any single direction, but everywhere at once. It was deep and resonant, yet strangely calm, sending chills down everyone's spines. "We are here," the voice said, reverberating through the room. Panic erupted instantly. People bolted for the exits, shoving past one another in their desperation to escape. But the doors wouldn't budge. Someone yanked on the handles repeatedly, only to find them locked tight. Others rushed to the windows, pounding on the glass, but it was as if the entire building had been sealed shut. There was no way out. Father Thomas, shaking uncontrollably, stepped forward, his instincts as a priest overriding his fear. Who is this?" he stammered, his voice barely audible over the chaos. "What do you want?" The voice responded, softer this time, but still commanding. "Do not fear us. We mean you no harm." At those words, the frantic energy in the room began to subside slightly. Though no one relaxed entirely, they hesitated, glancing at one another uncertainly. Was this some kind of trick, or was there truth in what the voice claimed? "We are those who were taken too soon," the voice continued, its tone almost mournful. "We have unfinished business." A hush fell over the congregation. Even the children, who moments ago had been crying loudly, went silent. Every eye was fixed on the empty caskets, as if expecting them to reveal more secrets. Father Thomas swallowed hard, gripping the edge of the pulpit for support. "Taken too soon," he repeated, his voice steadying ever so slightly. "What do you mean? Who took you?" The response came slowly, each word heavy with sorrow. "Truth lies buried beneath lies. Seek it, and you will understand." As the voice faded, the oppressive weight in the room lifted. The candle stopped flickering, burning steadily once more. The temperature rose slightly, and the air felt less charged. For the first time since the strange events began, people dared to breathe deeply again. But the silence that followed was deafening. No one moved. No one spoke. They simply stared at the empty caskets, their minds racing with questions. What did the voice mean by unfinished business? And what truth lay hidden beneath the surface of this seemingly ordinary town? Whatever answers awaited them, one thing was clear. This funeral had transformed into something far beyond grief and remembrance. It had become a doorway to secrets darker than anyone could have imagined. The silence after the voice faded was unbearable. It wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, as if the entire church was holding its breath, waiting for the next revelation. Father Thomas stood frozen at the pulpit, his knuckles white from gripping it so tightly. He glanced around the room, searching for guidance or reassurance, but all he saw were wide eyes and pale faces. Everyone seemed too stunned to move, let alone speak. Finally, a man in the front row broke the silence. "What does this mean?" he demanded, his voice trembling with both fear and frustration. "What truth are we supposed to seek? What unfinished business?" The question hung in the air like smoke, unanswered for several long moments. Then, just when some began to wonder if the voice would return, it spoke again. This time, it sounded closer, almost intimate, as though it had moved among them, standing invisibly in their midst. "We did not die naturally," the voice said, each word dripping with sorrow. "We were taken unjustly." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. People exchanged horrified glances, unsure of what to make of the statement. Taken unjustly. What could that possibly mean? Before anyone could ask, the voice continued. "Years ago, forces you cannot see manipulated our lives. An experiment gone wrong, a mistake buried deep beneath lies, stole us from this world before our time." The room erupted into murmurs. Some whispered about government conspiracies, while others shook their heads, refusing to believe such claims. But there were a few who listened intently, their expressions darkening as pieces of the puzzle began falling into place. "What kind of experiment?" Father Thomas asked, his voice firm despite the tremor beneath it. The voice hesitated, as if gathering strength, or perhaps deciding how much to reveal. When it finally answered, the words sent shockwaves through the congregation. "Energy manipulation. Dangerous tests conducted in secret, hidden even from those who lived nearby. They thought they could control it, but they failed, and we paid the price." At this point, tears streamed down the faces of some mourners. A young woman clutching a photograph of Priya sobbed uncontrollably, her body shaking. Others clenched their fists, anger bubbling up alongside their grief. How could something like this happen without anyone knowing? "They silenced us," the voice continued, growing softer now, almost pleading. They erased our names, our stories, everything that made us human. But we are still here. We have waited years for someone to hear us, to tell the world what truly happened. Father Thomas took a step forward, his heart pounding. "Why now?" he asked. "Why reveal yourselves today?" There was another pause, longer this time, as if the spirits were weighing their response carefully. When they finally spoke, their tone carried a mix of sadness and determination. "Because the living must carry the torch of justice, you must uncover the truth, not just for us, but for everyone who might suffer the same fate. Do not let our deaths be forgotten." As the final words echoed through the church, the atmosphere shifted once more. The oppressive weight lifted entirely, replaced by an eerie calm. The candles burned steadily, their flames no longer flickering wildly. The temperature returned to normal, and the air felt lighter, easier to breathe. For a moment, no one dared to move. Then, slowly, the locked doors creaked open on their own, swinging wide to reveal the bright sunlight outside. It poured into the church, illuminating the empty caskets and casting golden light over the stunned congregation. Father Thomas exhaled deeply, his shoulders sagging with exhaustion. He looked out at the crowd, meeting the eyes of those closest to him. Though fear lingered in every gaze, there was also resolve. Whatever had happened here today, it wasn't over. The spirit's plea for justice had ignited something within them, a determination to seek answers, no matter how difficult the journey ahead might be. And as people began filing out of the church, whispering amongst themselves, one thing became painfully clear: their lives, and the memory of the 5 lost souls, would never be the same again. As the congregation spilled out of the church into the bright sunlight, the initial shock began to give way to questions. People clustered in small groups on the steps and in the parking lot, their voices rising in a mix of disbelief, anger, and curiosity. The spirit's words had left them unsettled, but also determined to understand what had truly happened. Energy manipulation. What does that even mean? One man asked, scratching his head as he leaned against a car. "It sounds like something out of a movie." Another replied, shaking his head, "But how else do you explain what just happened in there?" Those caskets were empty. The mention of the empty caskets sent a shiver through the crowd. No one could deny the supernatural events they'd witnessed, or the chilling clarity of the voice that claimed responsibility for it all. Slowly, fragments of memory began surfacing among the townsfolk. Rumors about strange occurrences near the forest edge years ago started making rounds again. Some recalled hearing faint explosions or seeing unusual lights in the distance late at night. Others remembered stories of government agents visiting the area briefly before disappearing without explanation. Father Thomas stood near the church doors, watching silently as people pieced together scraps of information. His mind raced with possibilities, each more unsettling than the last. Could it be true? Had some secret experiment caused the deaths of Emma, James, Priya, Mark, and Sarah? And if so, why had no one investigated further at the time? Then, an elderly woman stepped forward, her face pale but resolute. Mrs. Harper, who had lived in the town for over 60 years, held up a trembling hand to quiet the murmurs. "I remember now," she said, her voice quivering but clear. "Back then, about 15 years ago, they told us it was a gas leak. That's why those 5 died suddenly. But," she hesitated, tears welling up in her eyes, "I saw things. Military trucks coming in during the middle of the night. Men in suits asking questions around town. They said not to worry, that everything was under control. But nothing felt right." Her words sent ripples through the crowd. More people began sharing their own recollections, details they dismissed at the time as unimportant or unrelated. A farmer spoke of finding patches of scorched earth near his fields shortly after the deaths. A shopkeeper mentioned overhearing hushed conversations between strangers wearing uniforms. Even Father Thomas admitted he'd been visited by a man claiming to represent national security weeks after the tragedy. They warned me not to dig too deep, he confessed, guilt weighing heavily on his shoulders. They said it would only cause panic. I thought they were telling the truth. I thought I was doing the right thing by staying silent. The realization hit everyone like a punch to the gut. The truth hadn't been buried because it was insignificant. It had been deliberately hidden. We have to tell someone, a young man said firmly, stepping forward. This isn't just about the past. It's about protecting others. If this really happened, we can't let it happen again. Nods of agreement spread through the group. Despite their fear, they knew they couldn't ignore what they'd learned. Someone suggested contacting journalists or activists who specialized in uncovering secrets. Another proposed organizing a town meeting to discuss next steps openly. For the first time since the funeral began, hope flickered amidst the grief and confusion. Though the road ahead promised challenges, and possibly danger, their resolve was unwavering. The spirit's plea for justice had awakened something within them, a determination to honor the memories of the 5 lost souls by bringing their story to light. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the quiet town, one thought lingered in everyone's minds. The truth might be painful, but silence could cost far more. The days following the funeral felt like a blur to the townsfolk. What had started as a somber gathering to mourn 5 lives turned into a whirlwind of revelations and restless determination. The truth about the mysterious deaths was no longer buried. It was alive, simmering just beneath the surface of their daily routines. People couldn't stop talking about it. Conversations buzzed in grocery stores, coffee shops, and even on street corners. Everyone wanted answers, but more importantly, they wanted justice. Father Thomas became an unexpected leader in this newfound movement. Haunted by his decision to stay silent years ago, he threw himself into uncovering every detail he could find. He spent hours poring over old newspapers, church records, and any documents he thought might hold clues. One evening, while searching through dusty files in the church basement, he stumbled upon something shocking. A handwritten note tucked inside a folder labeled confidential. It read simply, *, do not ask questions. For your safety and theirs. *. His hands trembled as he held the paper. This wasn't paranoia. It was proof that someone had gone to great lengths to keep the truth hidden. But who? And why? Meanwhile, others took different approaches. A group of younger residents decided to reach out to investigative journalists. They sent emails, made calls, and shared photos of the strange events at the funeral. Photos secretly taken by a teenager who had been filming the service on her phone. At first, most responses were dismissive. Sounds like superstition, one reporter wrote back. But when footage of the caskets opening on their own surfaced online, interest grew rapidly. News outlets began reaching out, eager to investigate further. As word spread beyond the town, tensions rose. Strangers started arriving. Reporters, conspiracy theorists, and even government officials claiming to be there to help. Some townsfolk welcomed them, hoping they'd bring clarity. Others were wary, fearing retaliation if too much attention was drawn. Late one night, a man knocked on Father Thomas's door. He introduced himself as Agent Monroe, flashing a badge that looked official enough to make the priest uneasy. "We need to talk," Monroe said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. His tone was calm but firm. "You've stirred up quite a storm here, Father. I'm here to ensure things don't spiral out of control." Thomas crossed his arms, standing his ground. "Are you saying we shouldn't seek the truth?" Monroe sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Look, I understand why you're doing this, but some secrets are dangerous, not just for you, but for everyone involved. Trust me, it's better to let sleeping dogs lie." Something about his words struck Thomas as hollow. If the truth was so harmless, why did the agent look so nervous? Why had those military trucks rolled into town years ago? The next morning, the spirits spoke again, not through eerie voices or flickering candles, but through whispers carried by the wind. As people walked along the forest edge, where the supposed experiments had taken place, they heard faint murmurs urging them onward. "Keep going," the voices seemed to say. "Tell our story." Inspired, the townsfolk organized a public meeting. Dozens gathered in the community hall, sharing what they knew and planning their next steps. Someone suggested creating a memorial not just for Emma, James, Priya, Mark, and Sarah, but for all victims of hidden experiments. Others proposed starting petitions or contacting lawmakers to demand transparency. By the end of the meeting, one thing was clear: the Spirit's message had ignited a fire within them. Their deaths wouldn't be forgotten. They would become a rallying cry for accountability. And though fear lingered, hope burned brighter. The dead may have spoken, but it was the living who would carry their torch forward. In the weeks that followed, the small town transformed into a hub of activity. Journalists flocked to the area, setting up cameras and microphones outside homes and businesses. National news outlets picked up the story, broadcasting interviews with residents who bravely recounted the events of the funeral and the revelations that followed. The footage of the empty caskets and flickering candles went viral online, sparking debates across social media platforms. Some dismissed it as an elaborate hoax, while others called for immediate investigations. But for the townsfolk, none of this mattered. They were determined to honor the Spirit's plea no matter what obstacles lay ahead. Father Thomas became the face of the movement, speaking passionately about uncovering the truth. He appeared on television shows, recounting how the voices had spoken during the funeral and how they revealed the horrifying reality of their untimely deaths. His words resonated deeply, especially when he held up the handwritten note he'd found in the church basement. "This isn't just about 5 lives lost," he said, his voice steadied despite the weight of emotion behind it. "It's about exposing the lies that have haunted us for years. We owe it to them, and to ourselves, to seek justice." The government's response was swift but vague. Officials promised inquiries, though many remained skeptical. Agent Monroe reappeared several times, attempting to dissuade the townsfolk from pursuing further action. "You're stirring up trouble you don't understand," he warned during one tense meeting. But his threats only strengthened their resolve. Meanwhile, the families of Emma, James, Priya, Mark, and Sarah worked together to create a memorial garden near the church. It was a peaceful space filled with flowers, benches, and plaques bearing each person's name and a short message about their dreams and passions. On the day of its unveiling, hundreds attended, not just locals but people from neighboring towns who had been moved by the story. As sunlight filtered through the trees, casting golden light over the gathering, Father Thomas delivered a heartfelt speech. "They may be gone," he said, looking at the crowd, "but their voices will never fade. They asked us to tell the truth, and we must continue fighting until the world knows what happened here." Slowly but surely, progress began to show. Activists joined forces with scientists and legal experts to investigate claims of secret experiments across the country. Stories similar to theirs emerge. Other towns affected by mysterious illnesses, sudden deaths, or unexplained phenomena linked to classified projects. A coalition formed, uniting victims' families under a shared mission: transparency and accountability. Though some feared retaliation, nothing could silence the growing outcry. Protest marches took place in major cities, demanding answers from those in power. Lawsuits were filed against government agencies suspected of involvement. While full closure remained elusive, the momentum gave people hope. At night, the wind still carried faint whispers through the forest, a reminder that the spirits hadn't fully departed. But instead of fear, the townsfolk felt comforted knowing they were being guided toward justice. One evening, as Father Thomas sat alone in the church, he noticed something unusual. The Bible he'd struggled to open during the funeral now lay open on the pulpit, its pages turned to a verse he'd read countless times before. Asterisk, "The truth shall set you free." Asterisk. He smiled softly, closing the book gently. Though the journey was far from over, he knew they were on the right path. The dead had spoken, and the living had listened. Their legacy would live on, not as victims, but as catalysts for change.